Okay, so as I said earlier, we're going to be doing a sample design from scratch for a simple problem, so that you have an example of that from the beginning. So let's pick something relatively straightforward, but also something that's similar to what you might have encounter in the wild, and we can even we'll do it using a different diagramming tool to the one that we used in the previous example during the orientation, just to give you a variety of options. Right, so let's take a look at writing a program that will take in a string that could represent a valid octal number or not, and then output whether or not the string does represent a valid octal number. Remember, not all sequences of symbols will be valid octal numbers. Some will be, some won't be. So we must test to see if a particular sequence of symbols is a valid octal number. So that's the basic idea. So we'll write a problem description. So create a program which prompts the user for a single, let's say, white space delimited. So what I mean by that, string. So basically, it's got no spaces inside it. It's just a single word, as it were. The program must then determine if this string represents a valid octal number or not, and must output this result to the standard output stream. So I'm not going to take in too many inputs and outputs. I noticed there was a query, so I'm just going to look at it quickly. Oh, you mean the empty template, the template with nothing in it? Yeah, I suppose I could do that for you. That's okay. I mean, the formatting doesn't really matter so much. You get the marks for the contents, but I guess if you want an okay-ish looking empty template, I will. So I'll post the one that we've done, and then I'll empty it out and post the empty one for you. Actually, let me just save this in a different file. So let's say design example, and then you'll have access to it. It's actually not a Word document. It's an open document, but I can convert it to Word. Work fine. All right. Mostly, so that's a good question here. Does it mean that we could rephrase what is written on the product for the problem design? Basically, that's what you have to do. In real life, obviously, you'll have to understand a particular problem in the real world, like some business process or some technical process, and then formalize that in a description. But in terms of the weekly practicals and the semester tests and exams, you basically just have to rephrase, summarize in one paragraph, effectively, what you need for the test. So very good. Did I misspell something? Okay. No, anyway, so let's take a look at this. So yeah, so this is going to be quite a simple one. It's just to get you the basic ideas. So we need to establish what our inputs and outputs are. So in this case, our input is going to be let's say a candidate octal number string. It will come into the program via the standard input stream. At the moment, that's your main mechanism, but you'll learn about at least one other way to get input into your program this semester, and then obviously later on you'll learn about files, and later on you'll learn about networking and stuff like that. That'll be more in the in your second year. Data could come from a variety of different places. So I think that'll be enough for this particular one. I can't think of any other input that needs to come in. It's just the string itself. Okay, and the output will be, let's say, that it will output success if valid octal. We'll output that to the standard output stream, and let's say it will treat error if invalid. It will treat that as an actual error, and we'll output that to the standard error stream. Okay. All right, so if you've got a data format, that's basically the variables that we're going to make use of. So let's take, again, I'm sorry, here there's been some comments and questions and things. Mechanism refers to how the thing gets into or out of your program. So basically, at the moment, your options are basically standard input, standard output, and standard error. At the moment, that's all. But basically, mechanism is how something happens. So in that case, it's how the things get in and out of your program. So I think one thing we could do is we could have a constant that will represent the octal symbols. You can't see the underscore there, so let's write it like that. I wonder why the underscores aren't showing up. There we go. And that we can make a constant string that will be the values 0 through to 7 in ASCII or sequence of values. Okay, and then we will need some way to process each element in the string. So the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to have a loop control variable that will represent the string, it's each character in the string. So I'll call that ch letter. That will just be a character. That will be each element in the input string. And do we even need much else for this? But in a pretty straightforward way. As I say, the point isn't to do an overly complicated algorithm, just to show you the basics. So let's delete that. We'll probably fit the pseudocode in here quite easily. So let's do that. You'll see if there's another question. What are the constant unique error? Oh yeah, I suppose we could do an error. Thank you. That's a very good point. We could do an error code for the for this. So the constant unique error codes. Remember, every time your program ends, it gives a return value to main, basically. And that says whether the program was successful, which is 0, or unsuccessful, which is some kind of error. So in this case, we wanted an invalid string or something like that. It'll be a constant integer. That will be an error code for invalid octal string. So basically, each one, and we can actually say what number we've assigned it. We're going to assign it number 1. All right, more questions? No, the attendance code comes towards the end, so you definitely can't have the attendance code now. It occurs somewhere randomly towards the end. You don't need it because you've logged onto the thing via Blackboard. It's only the people who watch this later who need the attendance code. If you've connected to the session, you already count as being here. And do we need the C+ code or a normal full name for the identifier? Technically speaking, in a design, you don't need to follow the rules of any one particular language because designs are supposed to be language neutral. So I tend to follow the conventions for C++ and the identifier names because that's what I'm going to write it as, but you don't actually have to. You can relax it a bit. But the C++ identifier rules are actually the same as the identifier rules for Visual Basic and the same as for Java and the same as for a bunch of languages. So it's actually fairly general. So it's not a bad idea to do that. All right, so we're going to keep this quite simple. So we're going to, maybe we could even add a Boolean for the valid or not. Insert rows below. So let's say BLN valid. That's just going to be a Boolean, and that's going to indicate is the string valid, a valid octal number. All right, so let's begin. So let's say, oops. Remember, there's no real strict syntax rules for pseudocode. The idea is you just specify broad ideas of what you're doing. So let's say that we let the input string, we didn't have the string either. Right, more I realize I'm missing things. I won't be able to fit that onto one thing now. So let's say str number, that's going to be a string, and that's the candidate octal number. I haven't been capitalizing octals, so let's not start now. All right, so let str number take on. Okay, there's like, there are better symbols for things like that. Doesn't look so nice in that particular thing. So if we insert symbol, more symbols, we could probably find the arrows in here somewhere. If not, I'll leave it, but arrows, there we go. Easy peasy. Perfect. There we go. So let the number take on capture input from standard stream. Say let ch letter take on the next letter in str number. So we can even do it something slightly differently. So we could just say for letter, each letter in str number. And then all we would need to do is to do something like if ch letter is in octal symbols, you can do it like this, BLN valid takes on the value of ch being in octal symbols. If not BLN valid, and we can say output error message to standard error stream. Exit with code. And yeah, otherwise at the end, we can say, let's just move all of this to the next page, so it's all neat. Otherwise, if it makes it here, we can say output success to standard error stream. And exit with success code. Not that that might be a little bit too much detail, but that's fine. So there's our pseudocode. And then for our UML activity diagram, must have had a page break or something. So it doesn't want to move. Yeah. Come on. See a page break. Oh, I'm not going to find Word at the moment. So this is decent enough pseudocode. We could put in an end if we want. There's no real strict rules. And so for the activity diagram, I'm going to use a different tool, but first I'm going to check your questions, see what they are. All right, so let's go back. Okay, constant unique error code. So remember, everything that goes wrong has a separate different code. So we've only got one thing that can go wrong here. It's invalid. We assigned that one. 0 means success. Anything that's non-zero is a different kind of failure. And specifying the variables in the data format, which variables go there? Do you include the variables with the intermediate steps as well? That's a great question. And the answer is it depends. If you think it's important for someone to understand that in order to successfully implement the algorithm, then you do. But if it's obvious, then you can leave it out. And what's obvious and what's non-obvious can depend on the sort of level of competence of the team you're working in. So there's no strict rule about that. Because obviously too much detail can make something more complicated than it needs to be, and not enough detail makes it impossible to implement. So it's a bit of a balancing act. It's a very good question. Very good question. How do you design a program for the pracs? We're literally doing that now. So hopefully that becomes more clear. So if statements. So when you code something, if something, actually saying that Boolean is true and therefore the code should be allowed to run. Okay, we can discuss that. So remember, an if statement will conditionally run code only if a particular statement is true. So here we're saying if this is not true, then we want this stuff to happen. So basically, you're using if statements to represent the paths that you can take in your logic. And in the same way that for loops and all other kinds of loops represent the different paths you can take. You'll see that when we do the UML now, there's no actual difference between an if statement and a loop. It's just where the path takes you. If the path takes you down a completely separate branch, then it's an if statement. But if the path takes you back to one of your previous activities, then it's a loop. So at the end of the day, they're all just flow control statements. So that's, yeah, so that basically sums that up. So that's excellent, well done. And will it to the market? That's a good question. Look, there's no clear rules about that. So if you do ever have a query about whether your UML was marked too strictly or not, remember you can ask the marker who marked you in the previous week during that Friday to say what they thought was right or wrong. Also, remember that Dr. Du Toit does post video memos, and you can watch those video memos and see maybe if it's clear what went wrong or not based on that video memo. But if you do have any queries, you can, of course, take it up with your marker later. So the error codes, it's like a error code 404, which you might know from the internet, is basically like an internet version of that. It's a code that says that something went wrong, right? And this is basically your program telling the operating system that something went wrong, whatever that thing might be. So there's no fixed meanings for what the error codes are. It's your job to assign those meanings. And that's why you should document those meanings in your design document, so that someone who runs your program and then sees that it exits with a different code can look up that meaning inside your design document. All of the videos are posted on Eve, so please be making use of the stuff that's available to you. So if you log on using your student number or whatever you've changed your password to, by now you should have changed your password to something else. As default to your password. And you look under the notice boards and you look under the things. Do we have the video memo there? That's a prac lecture. I think that's it. So I think if you look here, this should be your video memo for the first practical. Yeah, it looks about right. And it's by Dr. Du Toit. So you'll find them listed here. It'll be the lectures that occur on Fridays. There's no real lecture on a Friday, so that's it. So please take a look. They always come up after the deadline, obviously, but before the code is, before the marking session occurs. All right, so that's great. Now, before I used, in the orientation, I think it was, I used diagrams.net, which is available on the web, which seems to work okay. Now I'm going to use Dia, which is a different tool. There's no right or wrong one. You can use whatever you want. You can access Dia by downloading it as free software, but also if you want, you can go to eve.uj.ac.za/csc1, and both code blocks and Dia are accessible there. They might be slightly out of date from the most recent ones from the project's actual website, so bear in mind these might be older versions that we have online. We don't keep them up to date all the time, but they should work fine. Okay, firstly, okay, the ASCII table, if you look in the VLP lectures, there's a copy of the ASCII table there, or you could just search for ASCII table and you will find many copies of the ASCII table. ASCIItable.com will get you the ASCII table. Every single lecture is compulsory. So the lectures are compulsory, but the tutorials are not. So every lecture is compulsory. If you can't attend it live, you can watch it later and then use the code we give you to say that you attended. You're doing a lecture right now. I don't understand. I'm not sure what you're doing, but this is a lecture. We're currently going through an example for doing a design because that was requested, so that you are capable of doing those designs. Yeah, so we gave you sample designs. We spoke about the design, but we were asked if we could actually show you the process of creating one from scratch. So that's what we're doing now. Right. Dia is this tool. I'm used to it. I prefer that web-based one, but you might prefer the web-based one. That's up to you. You need to set the type to UML, just like you had to do in diagrams.net. Remember that the start of your program is a state, right, which is a solid circle, and the end of your program is a final state, which is a circle within a circle. Then in between that, you've got a bunch of activities, right? Activities represent each step in your process, so there should be a strong relationship between your UML and your pseudocode. So if we look at our pseudocode to guide us, we can say, first thing that we need to do is we need to capture the input, so we'll need an activity for that. Okay, capture input. Then what we need is to access each element, each letter in the things. That's actually making a decision. So we're going to say here, is this the current element or not? So maybe we can have an activity for that. We can say get next letter in sequence. Right. Okay, we've been using title case for this, so let's stick to title case. Yeah. Remember, your activities must be verb phrases. They must be something that can be done. It can't just be like an adjective or like or a noun or something. You can't just say error. Like that's not an action. Output error, however, is an action. So now we basically, once we've gotten a letter, we will need to check to see, is this a valid octal symbol? So is letter, so we just say check letter validity, check letter validity. Okay, and then that can either be true or false. So based on that, we're going to either output an error message, or maybe we're done, or maybe we're not done. So there's a couple of possibilities here. So let's say we're dealing with the possibility that this was an error. So we can say output error, and then we will go there. Otherwise, if it was valid and we make it through all of these, we can say output valid, and otherwise we need to go back and continue processing. So let's do that. We need transitions to link everything together. So we're going to link question of step 1 and step 2. These ones aren't going to make any difficult decisions. They're just going to flow directly one from the other, just like statements in your main, which aren't part of a loop or anything. Just each statement happens one at a time. Okay, now that we've done that, we need to make a decision. So something's invalid, we're done, or it was, there's still more to process. Right, so we can make a decision here. We flow into the branching point after we've checked the validity. Okay, here, this is what happens when the letter was invalid. So we put that information into our guard condition. So we can just say letter invalid, position that somewhere so that it looks readable. And then after we've output the error, the program will end. Okay. Otherwise, we still have, if we're in the case where it wasn't invalid, but we do have more letters. So more letters in sequence. So we get the next letter. And over here, we've got the situation where there's no more letters anymore. So we checked them all, none of them were invalid, and there aren't any more now, so we can leave that cycle. So we can say no more letters. Okay, let me just position these things neatly. And then when I'm done, I'll take a look at the comments that I can hear being made. Objects, align. So if it's align their middles, objects, align, spread out horizontally. Oops, and then I realize that we do need just a little bit more space for this. Let's just move that down there. If that was valid, we flow to the final state as well. You can have more than one final state if you want, but some people like to try and make it so that there's only one single final state. It's not a requirement, but it is eta. So we have this now. So this isn't a valid thing that we can put into our Word document. This is just a DIA diagram. Word doesn't understand them. So first we need to save them somewhere and export them into a format Word understands. So okay, so that's me doing that. Now a format that Word could understand, for example, might be PNG, which is an image format, portable network graphic. So if I do that and I say export, I hope that worked. Normally it should prompt me. Let's check to see if that worked out. If I take a look here, oh, that's long ago, wrong year, lectures, and there we have our image, which is decent, so we can put that into our document. Okay, obviously it would probably be better if you rotated it so that it was flipped so that you could see more of it, but I think this is okay. Let me just see, can I do that easily? No, that's just how it floats. I'm not going to waste too much time about that, but there you've got that example. And then you can convert it into a PDF, which is the preferred format from within Word, and save. So now you've got a Word version of this template, or of this example, sorry, a PDF version that you actually submit, and then that's your design. Okay, let me check your questions. So that's basically the whole process. I'm just going to scooch back up to go back down from where we used to be. Okay, blah, blah, blah. If it is posted, we have that. ASCII table must all be attended. Done, done, done. All right, 3 error codes. Sorry, I'm not going to deal with specific questions like that in the class. Please ask those during the work hours, and specifically ask them of the assistants during the periods on the roster. Can I declare more than one variable on the same line if they're of the same type? Yes, you can. We typically don't do it in that style, but it is legal. Just remember that you need to initialize all of them. Otherwise, they will have indeterminate values. So yeah, just joining the live lectures on BB counts as your attendance. You don't have to do anything else. Use the flow diagram from Word. So the diagram, the website we used's name was diagrams.net. Remember, you have access to all of the videos. There's no need for me to repeat that. You can look it up. And then DIA is, as you see, available from eve.uj.ac.za/CSC1. Both code blocks and DIA are there for you to download if you need them. Will Prac 3 be due after the Easter? There's no holidays. First work through the holidays because you started late. So no, I mean, if you mean, is there like, you don't work on the actual literal public holidays, but the recess that the second years get for that week, you don't have. There will be classes in that time. On the actual public holidays, there won't be, obviously, but during that week won't be off. A diamond means a decision. And yes, there's a great observation here. Is notice that you can have more than one outcome from this diamond. It doesn't have to be like an if statement. False. It just means a decision is being made there. So it's not exactly the same as any particular statement in any language. It's simply saying a decision is made here, and from that decision we are going to flow to somewhere else. But you can, if you want to do more complicated things, have one diamond flow into another diamond, flow into another, making multiple branching decisions. That could also work so that it doesn't get too complicated. Does PLAC 2 require UML 2? If there's a design, it needs a UML. That UML is part of the design. All right, yeah, correct. With more letters in the sequence, what does this mean? With the more letters. Oh, okay, so good question. So over here, when we're saying, are there more letters in the sequence, we're basically saying at each step, we're going to get one letter at a time. And then we're going to do something with that letter, check its validity. So basically, we'll move from letter 0, the first letter in the number we're checking. Let's say, for example, we're checking the number 1, 2, 3, 2, 7, 8, 3, which is invalid. First, we check 1, that's valid. Then we check 3, that's valid. Then we check that's valid, 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 invalid, error. So we need something that takes on the value of each of these one at a time. And that's what we mean here. Have we reached the end of that number yet or not? Are there any more letters in the sequence to process? Question? So yes, when you implement them, we typically put our constant error codes outside of main before main. So yes, that's precisely right. If you're saying that if you have 5 if stems, you have the 5 diamonds, no, you can combine the diamonds because they just mean a decision is being made. But obviously, it's not feasible to have too many things branching out of this one shape. It'll get messy. So you can have one diamond lead straight into another diamond if you want. There's no problem with that. Attendance code comes at the end. So Word is inappropriate for UML? It's not. It's just like there are better tools for it. So I mean, you could hand draw your UML, take a picture of it, and paste that into your Word document as well. It's just there are better tools. You're more likely to make a mistake if you use Word because, let's say, for example, you forget that you're supposed to put the little braces around, the little square brackets around that, or you forget the double circle. So of course you can do it. It just increases the likelihood of an error. Okay, I don't know what that means. That's another question. When counting marks for the whole semester, do you take the prac with highest mark? Yes. So we will actually take your top, typically it's the top 7 practicals that we take. But we can vary that from year to year. So, but try your hardest, because basically every one of the, so it's still right now at this point in time possible to get 100%, even if you've gotten nothing up until this point in time. So a switch, there's no difference between a switch statement or a series of if statements or a loop in UML. They're simply decision points. So you can have this or a sequence of these, as many as you need for it to make sense. So it repeats until complete, exactly right. Yeah, I've never tried to use LibreOffice for the UML itself. I wouldn't even attempt it. But anyway, so now you've seen a different way of doing a design. I will upload this empty template for you guys. I'll convert it into Word now, so that you have it. And I will upload the empty one so that if it's easier for you to format your stuff, if that makes your lives easier. Okay, all right. I don't understand your question. Does conversion errors refer to the 0.01 error from rounding errors? What conversion error? Did I say conversion error at some point? I really don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, I'll upload it right after the lecture. So if you're talking about the practical, please ask the questions in the Discord server. Yeah, I don't think I mentioned conversion errors at all. So what method of separating operations is considered good coding practice, especially if statements followed by while loops? That really does depend. We will use a combination of things like libraries and just separate functions, as well as you have the option of splitting your program up into separate executables. There's no fixed rule. That's sort of a style that develops over time. Can you use Lucidcharts? Lucidcharts is excellent. You can use Lucidcharts if you want. I don't use it, but I've seen it being used. It's very powerful. If you want to use that, knock yourself out. Go for it. But we don't care as long as the end diagram is readable. That's what we look at. Yeah, I'm not doing practical things now. I'm showing you how to do a design, but I'm not answering questions about the practical per se. Please ask those in the Discord server. All right. So all of the things are available from within Eve. So you click on practicals, and unsurprisingly, there are your practicals. All right, thank you. All right, let's begin. Or let's continue rather. So I think we've used up most of our time, but hopefully that was useful for you, because there were quite a few requests for it. So let's just see how much time we have left. Yeah, not much time left at all, unfortunately. Yeah, so we're just going to have to continue with that. But this first set of lecture slides is actually fairly introductory stuff. We've done that stuff in the tutorials, but this is just the more details for it. So I'll carry on for a few more minutes, and we'll see where we get to. Okay, so we were dealing with the different kinds of real values. Floating point values, and there were different ways of expressing them. I typically just write them out as long decimal numbers, but you can use a variant of floating point of scientific notation to represent them, where basically instead of saying times 10 to the power of whatever, you say e for exponent, and then the power of the exponent comes afterwards. So you might see that when you output floating point numbers, sometimes it'll shorten them to this notation as well. So floats represent real numbers, but they only use 4 bytes of space. They're not that accurate. We won't ever use floats directly. We're going to just make use of doubles, which use twice the amount of space. So they're way, way, way more accurate. So seeing twice the amount of space doesn't mean just twice the amount of range. You can see it goes from 38 to the power of 38 to rather the power of 300. That is a huge difference in terms of orders of magnitude bigger. So doubles are by far better than floats. We won't ever choose to use a float directly. There might be some libraries that use floats. For example, if you looked at the tutorials, you'll see I use the fabs function to do the floating point absolute value. That uses floats as its inputs, but we won't ever choose floats for our own data types. So I think that's enough for that. Yeah, so here's just some examples of some things being declared. Remember, the textbook doesn't use the Hungarian notation that we use, but it's still not too bad because at least it's readable variable names. Don't give completely garbage variable names to your code. Now, however, before I forget and before we do run out of time, let's actually do the code. So there is your code for people who are late. It's the none of you in this thing need it, but for the people watching this on YouTube later, that's the attendance code. All right, and let's continue. Assignment statements, as we've seen. We've also seen in the tutorials a variety of operations being used. In particular, we took a look at the modulus operator for giving remainders. And you'll see in the VPL exercises, there's also the one that will test to see if something is wholly divisible by 10. Using the modular operator for that is very, very useful. Plus, minus, multiplication, and divide can be used with both integral and floating point data, whereas modulus can only be used for integral data. And the important thing to note, it'll actually be discussed on a future slide, is that if you mix floating point and integer stuff, it's going to wind up being floating point. So basically it takes it pair by pair and then decides what the overall type will be. So if I did something like this, how's it going to work that out? It's going to say, this is a floating point number divided by an integer. This thing's type is float. Therefore, this is going to be a float divided by 2. So the whole thing's type is float. And therefore, it's a float multiplied by 2. So the whole thing's type is float. So basically, if there's a single float in there, the overall type will be float. You just have to be very careful if you're doing stuff like this. The order of operations will be try to do this first. Oh, this is integer divided by integer. It's going to be 0. Throw the fraction away. So if you do want to be sure, you can just make sure that those things are floating points. Or you'll see later on, there's the ability to cast them to a different type. There's the order of operations. It's basically BODMAS or BEDMAS or PEMDAS, however you learned it in school. And then this is what I mentioned earlier, is that if you've got integer expressions, the overall thing will be integer. If you've got floats, the overall type will be float. But if you've mixed them, then whenever you've got a combination of integer and float, the type will be float at the end of the day. Float or double or whatever. So that is basically that. Okay, you can manually convert things from one type to another. So instead of doing this 2.0, we could do this static cast to a double of 2. Now I think that's slightly less readable than just going 2.0, but that does actually force it to be a double rather than just a regular float. So that might be important. So we won't need to do this sort of thing too often, but if you do need to force it to interpret something as a particular type, that'll do it. I'm going to take a look at the questions now. Well, you can always relook at the video, and you don't need to know the code. I've explained this to you already. You've joined the lecture. All right. Okay. If you want a number, yeah. So now this, you won't be able to use the casting to convert hello world into a number because that'll cause an error. Oh, is that what you were asking about? It's an error in conversion in the sense that one value is being converted into another value. Conversion errors aren't a different kind of thing to user error. There's overlap. It's not like a all or nothing thing. Think of like a Venn diagram with overlapping circles. You'll have some things that are at the intersection of different kinds of errors. So you can have user errors that are conversion errors. It's a good point that you're making though. But yeah. So here's just some examples of various types being converted. So here's an example of a dangerous one here because we've got the division occurring inside the brackets. So that's going to wind up becoming as, let me just check that. These don't line up neatly. Something's gone weird here. Oh, this is a much longer expression. But yeah, to me, the way I interpret this, we're going to have a 0 over here because 15 divided by 2, sorry, it's not 2 divided by 15. We're going to be left with 7, and then we're going to wind up with our final result. So that's okay. Yeah, that's correct. But we won't. You won't be writing code that looks like this with a whole bunch of casts. You'll cast every now and again when you need to. It's not going to be a super common occurrence. We've looked at the string data type. We've seen that it's a sequence of ASCII characters. We've seen that the letters are numbered from 0 up to length -1. In order to work with stuff, we need to get it into memory. That means we need to read it into a variable. We've seen in the tutorials that if you don't want a value to change, you can label it as being a constant. And we typically name our constants in all caps with underscores. As you can see, the textbook follows that convention as well. You can declare multiple variables in one go, as they're doing over there. We typically won't in our style, but it is legal. The danger here is, as we say, like int x comma y. Neither x nor y actually have an initial value. So you could write it out something like int x equals 0, y equals 0. I think that's all right. I just think it gets a little bit much. I prefer to write them individually, linearly, but it's not a rule. You're not going to lose any marks for doing it differently. At the moment, you know how to assign values into variables, and you know how to use the stream operators to read a value into the variable. All right. It's safer. It's more a style thing. I think it's safer because I think that if a line is too long going off to the right, it's easier to miss something. So I prefer it, but that really isn't a rule. That's a weak preference. We've seen assignments before, so I don't think we need to dwell too much on this. So I don't think we actually need to. So this is just all talk about assignments. One thing that's a bit interesting is you actually chain assignments over here. So I could do something like this. I could say x is equal to y is equal to 0. So it'll evaluate that from right to left. Y is equal to 0 will give back 0, and then x will be equal to 0. So everything will be equal to 0 in one go. Something that actually becomes important in the second semester more than now. Okay, I don't think there's anything that we need to really worry too much about there. Streaming can also be chained if you want. So you can go cin into x into y, and it'll read first into x and then into y. Sometimes that's useful to do. Okay, there's some examples. Look at this. Pre and post increment, and then I think I'm going to stop because I think we're a bit over time there, although we did start a bit late. So I'm just going to end off with this. So we very often want to add 1 to a number. So let's say we have int x is equal to 0. We can say x is equal to x plus 1. Or very commonly we say x plus plus. But there's a very weird side effect of this. You can also say plus plus x. So what's the difference between saying x plus plus and plus plus x? Well, not really much if you're not using the result of that expression. If you just want to increase x by 1, they have exactly the same meaning. But let me do it like this. Let me say x is equal to y is equal to 0. If I do cout x plus plus, I'm going to get 0 as my output. And if I go cout plus plus y, I'm going to get 1 as my output. At the end of the day, though, both x and y will have the value 1 at the end of the day. So it only matters if you're using the result, the returned result of that operation, whether you do plus the post or pre-increment or post or pre-decrement version of that operation. So yeah, you don't use cin and end line together. Cout and end line work together. So I think that's where we're going to have to stop. So this is basically that discussion that I just had now. You can chain outputs. So you've been doing that from the beginning. There's nothing interesting there. Instead of end line, you can use \n. From your point of view, there's very little difference. The main difference is that it's what they say flushes the output, but you don't care about the results of that. There's a bunch of those special escape sequences that you can use if you want: end of line, a tab character, backspace, carriage return, an actual backslash. You need to backslash it twice, or a literal single quote or a literal double quote. If you want those inside your strings, you have to escape them. And I think we'll end off here with preprocessor directives. So I think that's a good place to stop. So if you're saying, let me just end off with your last question there. So if you've got a char C equals like that, if there's nothing in here, that's invalid. If there's a space there, then that's just the empty space character. The prescribed textbook is available from Van Skyks on textbook. Presentations are all available from Eve. It's the set of lecture slides over there. All right, so I think we're going to stop now. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We've only got a couple of slides left in this. So we'll, when we get to our next set of lecture slides, we'll just finish these off and then start on the next bunch. There's not really that much left here except for preprocessor directives, which you have seen. So just to explain them in more detail. So we're going to be done now. Thank you very much. I'm going to end the recording now. Have a good evening.